Claire was the type of woman who prided herself on hard work and compassion. Having built her business from the ground up, she knew what it was like to struggle. Life hadn't always been easy for her. She had grown up with very little, and she never forgot where she came from. Now, with a thriving business and a beautiful home in a wealthy neighborhood, she found herself wanting to give back. She often donated to charities and supported causes that helped those in need. But recently something had been tugging at her, a desire to do more than just write checks. One crisp autumn evening, while driving home from a business meeting, Claire's eyes caught sight of a man standing at the intersection. He wasn't much older than her, though his weathered face and unkempt appearance made it hard to tell. Beside him was a small boy, no more than 8 years old, clinging to the man's side with wide, anxious eyes. They held a simple cardboard sign. "Need help? Anything will do." Claire slowed her car as she passed them, her heart sinking. She had seen people asking for money on the streets before, but this felt different. Maybe it was the child's forlorn expression, or the man's look of quiet desperation. She pulled over to the side of the road, turning off her engine. For a moment she hesitated. What could she really do to help? But then she reminded herself of her commitment to be a force for good. She grabbed her purse, exited the car, and approached the pair. "Hi there," Claire said gently, looking between the man and the boy. "Are you okay?" The man looked startled at first, as though he hadn't expected anyone to stop. His face softened into a tired, grateful smile. We're getting by," he said, though the weariness in his voice betrayed him. Claire's eyes shifted to the boy, who was clutching a tattered backpack. He didn't look up, his eyes fixed on the ground. "This your son?" she asked. The man nodded. "Yeah, this is Ethan." He put a protective arm around the boy's shoulders. "I'm Jake. We've had a tough few months. I lost my job and we lost our apartment. We've been trying to make it work, but it's been hard." Claire's heart broke a little more with each word. She wanted to help, but giving them a few dollars didn't feel like enough. She thought of her large house, with its unused guest space in the garage. It wasn't much, but it was warm, safe, and far better than sleeping on the streets. "Listen," Claire began, unsure if this was the right thing to do. "I have a guest space at my house. It's not big, but there's a bed and a bathroom. You and Ethan are welcome to stay there for a while until you get back on your feet." Jake's eyes widened in surprise, his mouth opening as if he was about to speak, but then closing again. He looked down at Ethan, who still hadn't said a word. I don't know what to say," Jake stammered. "We don't want to be a burden." "You wouldn't be," Claire said quickly. "I know what it's like to struggle, and I have more than enough space. I want to help." Jake hesitated, glancing at his son before nodding. "If you're sure, I can't thank you enough. Really." Claire smiled, relieved that they accepted her offer. "Let's get you out of the cold." In no time, they were following her car to her home. Claire's house was as grand as it was welcoming, with its sprawling lawn, towering trees, and large wraparound porch. Jake's eyes widened slightly as they pulled into the driveway, but he said nothing. Claire led them through the side entrance to the garage, which had been converted into a small guest suite. The room was modest but cozy. A bed in the corner, a small bathroom, and a table with a few chairs. "This is all yours for now," Claire said, turning to Jake. "Make yourselves comfortable. There's a mini fridge with some food, but feel free to come inside if you need anything." Jake looked around in disbelief, then down at Ethan, who was still clinging to his side. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion. This means everything." Claire nodded and smiled softly. "You're welcome. Get some rest." Over the next few days, Jake and Ethan settled into their temporary home. At first, everything seemed perfect. Jake was polite and grateful, always making sure to clean up after themselves. He assured Claire that he was actively looking for work, and that he appreciated her help more than words could express. Claire felt good about her decision. It was one thing to donate to charity, but this, directly helping someone, felt different, more personal. Ethan, however, was a different story. He rarely spoke even when Claire tried to engage him. Whenever she brought food or checked on them, the boy would hide behind Jake or sit quietly in the corner, avoiding eye contact. Claire didn't think much of it at first. She assumed the boy was simply shy or maybe traumatized by their recent struggles. Children dealt with hardship in different ways, after all. One evening, as Clara was bringing over some extra blankets for the garage, she noticed something strange. As she approached the door, she could hear voices inside. At first, she thought Jake might be talking to someone on the phone, but as she got closer, the conversation became more bizarre. Jake's voice sounded frantic, almost as if he was arguing with someone, but there was no other voice responding. Claire stood outside for a moment, unsure whether to knock or leave them alone. Before she could make a decision, the door suddenly opened, and Jake stood in the doorway. His face was flushed, and he looked startled to see her. "Oh, Claire, I didn't hear you knock," he said quickly, glancing back over his shoulder. "I didn't knock yet," Claire replied, trying to peer past him. "Is everything okay?" Jake forced a smile, though his eyes seemed unsettled. Yeah, everything's fine. Just talking to myself, stress and all. What's up?" Claire held up the blankets. "Just thought you might need these. It's getting colder at night." Jake relaxed slightly and took the blankets from her. "Thanks. That's really kind of you." Claire nodded, but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. She glanced around the room, noticing that Ethan wasn't there. "Where's Ethan?" "He's just resting," Jake said, gesturing toward the corner of the room where a small pile of blankets lay on the floor. "He's been having trouble sleeping, so he's lying down." Claire forced a smile, not wanting to press further. "All right, well, let me know if you need anything else." That night, Claire lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the strange conversation or Jake's nervous behavior. It was Ethan. The boy was so quiet, so withdrawn, and there was something unsettling about the way he stared at her, like he was trying to communicate something without words. Claire told herself she was just being paranoid, but the feeling of unease continued to grow. The following day, Claire invited her friend Susan over for coffee. Susan had been Claire's confidant for years, always offering practical advice and a level-headed perspective. As they sat on the porch, Claire recounted the story of Jake and Ethan, explaining how she had taken them in and the strange feeling she couldn't shake. "You're too trusting," Susan said, sipping her coffee. "I get that you want to help, but you barely know these people. Have you even done a background check on him?" Claire frowned. "No, I didn't think that was necessary. He seems like a good guy and his son is with him. I don't think they're dangerous." Susan raised an eyebrow. "You can never be too careful. People can seem nice on the surface, but you don't know what they're hiding. You should at least look into his story, make sure he's who he says he is." Claire sighed, feeling a bit defensive. "I don't want to invade his privacy like that. He's already been through enough." "I get that," Susan said, softening her tone. "But just be careful, okay? You have a lot to lose if something goes wrong." As Susan's words lingered in her mind, Claire couldn't help but wonder if she was being naive. After all, she didn't really know Jake. He could be anyone, and as much as she wanted to trust him, something about the situation just didn't feel right. The days that followed left Claire increasingly unsettled. Despite her best efforts to push the nagging doubts out of her mind, little things kept happening that she couldn't ignore. At first they seemed minor, insignificant even. A mug that she could have sworn she had left on the kitchen counter was suddenly in the sink. A set of keys that she always kept in the foyer had been moved to the living room. Claire brushed it off as her own forgetfulness, chalking it up to her busy schedule. But then, more unusual things started happening. One morning, Claire noticed that a scarf she had left in her coat closet was missing. She searched high and low, convinced that she had simply misplaced it, but it was nowhere to be found. The next day, a pair of shoes disappeared from her front porch. Then, an old photo frame, something with no real value, vanished from her living room. None of these items were particularly expensive, but it was strange, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside her house while she wasn't home. At first, she thought maybe Jake had borrowed something. After all, he and Ethan had access to the house, and Jake seemed trustworthy enough. But why would he take a scarf or a pair of shoes? It didn't make sense, and the more she thought about it, the more paranoid she became. The final straw came one evening when Claire returned home from work and found the back door to her house slightly ajar. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, calling out for Jake and Ethan. There was no answer. She checked every room, but nothing appeared to be out of place, except for the fact that the door had clearly been left open. Claire's instincts told her that something was seriously wrong. She couldn't just ignore it anymore. That night, as Claire lay in bed, her thoughts kept drifting back to the unsettling events of the past few days. She replayed her conversation with Susan over and over in her mind. Maybe Susan was right. Maybe she had been too trusting. Jake and Ethan seemed like good people, but she didn't really know them. What if she was wrong about them? Determined to ease her mind, Claire decided to install a small security camera in the garage. She didn't want to make Jake feel uncomfortable, but she also needed to know if something strange was happening. The camera would give her peace of mind. If nothing else, it would allow her to confirm that Jake and Ethan were behaving normally. The next morning, while Jake and Ethan were out, Claire discreetly set up the camera in a corner of the garage, hidden behind a stack of old boxes. She felt a bit guilty for invading their privacy, but it was the only way to quell her growing anxiety. Once the camera was in place, she returned to her house and went about her day, trying to push the unease to the back of her mind. The footage from the camera wouldn't record until later that night, but Claire was already on edge as the evening wore on. Every small noise made her jump, and every shadow seemed suspicious. When she finally climbed into bed, it was with a mix of nervous anticipation and dread. The next morning, Claire woke up early, eager to check the footage. She opened her laptop and pulled up the live feed from the camera, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first few hours, everything seemed normal. Jake and Ethan returned to the garage after their evening out, and Jake tucked Ethan into bed before lying down himself. But as the night wore on, the footage took a strange turn. It started with Jake sitting up in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the wall. He seemed to be muttering something under his breath, though the camera's microphone couldn't pick up what he was saying. After a few minutes, Jake got up and began pacing around the small room, still muttering to himself. His movements were erratic, as though he was agitated or arguing with someone, but no one else was there, at least no one visible on the camera. What made Claire's skin crawl was the way Ethan, who had appeared to be asleep, suddenly sat up in bed as well. The boy didn't move or speak. He just sat there watching his father with wide, unblinking eyes. Then, almost as if he sensed the camera's presence, Ethan slowly turned his head and stared directly at the lens. Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was as if Ethan knew she was watching. His gaze was intense, almost accusing. The boy's face was expressionless, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way he stared into the camera. It was as though he was trying to communicate something that Claire couldn't quite grasp. The footage continued like this for several minutes, with Jake pacing and muttering while Ethan sat motionless, his eyes locked on the camera. Finally, Jake returned to bed, and the room fell silent once more. Claire closed her laptop, her hands trembling. What had she just witnessed? Was Jake mentally unstable? Was Ethan aware of the camera the whole time? Claire knew she had to confront Jake about what she had seen, but she wasn't sure how to approach the conversation. She spent the rest of the day in a haze, her mind racing with possibilities. Was Jake dangerous? Was Ethan in some kind of trouble? And what, if anything, should she do about it? That evening, Claire knocked on the door to the garage, her heart pounding in her chest. Jake answered quickly, greeting her with a smile that seemed forced. Ethan was sitting on the bed, his back turned to her. "Hey, Claire," Jake said, his voice tight. "Everything okay?" Claire swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need to talk to you, Jake. Something's been bothering me, and I don't want to ignore it anymore." Jake's expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "What's going on?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already had an idea of what she was about to say. "I set up a camera in the garage," Claire admitted, her eyes searching Jake's face for any sign of recognition or guilt. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I've been feeling uneasy about some things, and I needed to know if everything was okay." For a moment, Jake said nothing. His eyes darted toward Ethan, who remained silent, his back still turned. Finally, Jake sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I get it," he said quietly. "I probably would have done the same thing if I were in your shoes." Claire was surprised by his calm response, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down just yet. "I watched the footage from last night," she continued, her voice steady but firm. "I saw you pacing and talking to yourself. And Ethan, he was awake the whole time, staring at the camera." Jake's face tightened, and he glanced nervously at his son again. "Ethan has trouble sleeping," he said quickly. "He gets nightmares sometimes, and I was just trying to calm myself down. It's been a stressful few months, and I guess I was talking out loud, without realizing it." Claire wasn't satisfied with his explanation. "It wasn't just talking, Jake. You seemed angry, like you were arguing with someone." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room. "I told you, it's just stress. I didn't mean to scare you or make you think anything weird was going on." Claire crossed her arms, feeling torn between her instinct to believe him and the growing sense of dread that had been building inside her for days. "I want to trust you, Jake, but I need you to be honest with me. Is there something going on that you're not telling me?" Jake opened his mouth as if to respond, but before he could say anything, Ethan finally spoke. His voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill down Claire's spine. "Don't trust him," Ethan said, his eyes still fixed on the floor. "He's not who he says he is." Claire's heart skipped a beat as she turned to face the boy, her mind racing. What did he mean by that? Had Jake lied about something? Was Ethan in danger? Jake's face went pale and he took a step toward his son. "Ethan, don't..." But Ethan cut him off, his voice growing louder and more urgent. "He's not my dad." Claire felt the world around her tilt, her breath catching in her throat as Ethan's words hung in the air. "He's not my dad." Those 4 words sent a shockwave through her, reverberating in her chest and mind, as if they had shattered the fragile reality she had been living in. She stared at the boy, her thoughts scrambling to make sense of what he had just said. Ethan's small, trembling form, sitting on the edge of the bed, looked even more fragile now, like a child carrying a secret far too heavy for his little shoulders. His wide, dark eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and something deeper, something akin to relief, finally met hers. He had been hiding this truth, bearing the weight of it, and now he had let it out. Before she could fully process the situation, Jake's voice cut through the thick, suffocating silence, sharp and desperate. "Ethan, stop it! You don't know what you're talking about!" Claire's head snapped toward Jake, her pulse racing. His face was contorted with a strange combination of panic and anger, his eyes wild, darting between her and Ethan like a cornered animal. This wasn't the calm, humble man she had taken in. The man who had thanked her over and over for her kindness. No, this was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Jake took a step toward Ethan, and Claire instinctively moved to stand between them, her body tense, her hands trembling slightly. "What did he mean, Jake?" she demanded, her voice low but firm. "What is going on?" "I told you he doesn't know what he's saying," Jake shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. His eyes were wide, pleading, but behind them, Clary could see the thin veneer of control slipping away. "He's confused. He's just a kid, Claire. You can't take what he says seriously." But Claire wasn't convinced. The panic in Jake's voice wasn't just concern for Ethan. It was fear. Real, palpable fear. And the more Jake protested, the more certain Claire became that something terrible had been hiding beneath the surface all along. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Ethan," she said softly, keeping her gaze on the boy. "What did you mean when you said he's not your dad? Where is your real father?" Ethan's eyes flickered to Jake, then back to Claire. His lips quivered as though he was struggling to find the right words, but when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know where my real dad is," he said, his small voice trembling. "Jake, he took me." Those 3 words, "he took me," were like a punch to the gut. Claire staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears, her entire body shaking. Jake took him. The room seemed to spin as the full weight of the truth settled over her. Jake wasn't Ethan's father. He had kidnapped him, and she had unknowingly allowed them into her home, believing she was helping a family in need. Horror clawed at Claire's chest, and she could feel the bile rising in her throat as the implications of it all began to unravel in her mind. "Claire, please listen to me," Jake said, his tone now soft, almost pleading. He was trying to maintain some semblance of control, but his eyes were wild and his body was tense, as though he was ready to lunge at any moment. "It's not what you think. I didn't kidnap him. I've been taking care of him. He's better off with me. His real parents, they didn't care about him. They neglected him. I saved him." But Claire didn't believe him. Not anymore. "Saved him," she repeated, her voice shaky but growing stronger as she stepped forward. "Is that what you're telling yourself? That you saved him by taking him away from his family?" Jake's expression hardened, and a flicker of something dark and dangerous passed over his face. "You don't know anything, Claire," he growled. "You don't know what it was like. I did what I had to do." Claire's chest tightened, her mind racing. She needed to get Ethan away from him. Now. But how? If she tried to run or call for help, Jake might snap. There was no telling what he was capable of. Her eyes darted to her phone, which was sitting on the kitchen counter just a few feet away. If she could get to it, maybe she could call the police. Quietly, without Jake noticing. Ethan, as if sensing her fear, shifted slightly on the bed, his small hands gripping the edge of the blanket. His eyes were still on her, wide and pleading. She had to act. She had to protect him. Forcing herself to stay calm, Claire took a step back, her eyes still locked on Jake. "Jake," she said slowly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I understand that you think you were helping Ethan, but this isn't the way to do it. You have to let him go. Let me help you. We can figure this out together." Jake's face twisted into a grimace, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck bulged. "No," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low and threatening. "You're not taking him from me. I'm the only one who can take care of him now." The tension in the room was unbearable. Claire could feel the pressure building, the walls closing in. She had to act fast before things spiraled out of control. Keeping her movements slow and deliberate, she started edging toward the kitchen counter, her eyes never leaving Jake. Jake's gaze followed her every move, his expression growing more suspicious by the second. "What are you doing?" he asked sharply, his voice rising with panic. "Where are you going?" "I'm just getting my phone," Claire said, trying to sound casual. "I need to call someone. Maybe a social worker. Someone who can help us figure this out." "No," Jake snapped, stepping toward her with alarming speed. "You're not calling anyone." Claire's heart leapt into her throat as he moved closer, his eyes wild and dangerous. She froze, her hand hovering just inches away from the phone. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the way his entire body was coiled like a spring, ready to explode at any moment. He was on edge, and she knew that one wrong move could push him over. But before she could make another move, Ethan suddenly spoke again, his voice trembling but filled with a quiet bravery that took Claire by surprise. "He's lying," Ethan said, his voice louder now, more certain. "He took me from my school. He told me we were going on a trip, but I didn't want to go. He won't let me call my mom." Jake's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, Claire thought he might lash out at the boy. But instead, he turned on Claire, his expression dark and menacing. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he hissed, taking another step toward her. "You think you can just take him away from me? I won't let you do that." Claire's mind raced as she realized she had no choice but to act now. Without thinking, she lunged for the phone, grabbing it off the counter and backing away as fast as she could. Jake lunged after her, but Claire was quicker, dialing 911 with trembling fingers as she held the phone to her ear. 911. "What's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled on the other end. "There's a man in my house," Claire whispered frantically, her voice shaking. "He's not who he says he is. He took a child. Please, send help right away." Jake's eyes widened with fury as he realized what she had done. He let out a guttural roar and charged toward her, but Claire ducked out of the way just in time, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran toward the front door, grabbing Ethan by the hand as she passed the garage. Together, they sprinted out into the driveway, Claire's breath coming in ragged gasps as she fumbled with her keys, trying to unlock the car. In the distance, Claire could already hear the faint sound of sirens approaching. She prayed they would arrive in time. Jake stood in the doorway, his face twisted with fury, watching as Claire and Ethan climbed into the car. He didn't try to follow them. He knew it was over. As the sirens grew louder, Jake turned and disappeared back into the garage, vanishing into the darkness. Claire held Ethan close, her heart still racing as the police cars pulled into the driveway. She could barely believe what had just happened. But it was over now. The nightmare was over, or at least she hoped it was. The aftermath of that night left Claire shaken to her core. As the police cars swarmed her driveway, red and blue lights flashing in the darkness, Claire sat in her car holding Ethan close. She could feel his small body trembling against hers, and she gently stroked his hair, trying to offer him comfort, though she had little comfort left to give herself. Within minutes, the officers surrounded her home, their guns drawn as they cautiously approached the garage. Claire had told them everything she knew, but even as she spoke, her mind struggled to fully grasp what had happened. Jake, this man she had opened her home to, trusted and even felt compassion for, was not who she thought. He was a kidnapper, and the boy she had seen as shy and traumatized was the victim of something far darker than she had ever imagined. One of the officers came over to her, leaning down to meet her eyes through the car window. His voice was calm but authoritative, and the seriousness of his tone reminded Claire of how real the danger had been. "Ma'am, we're going to take him into custody," the officer said. "You and the boy are safe now, but we'll need to get statements from both of you, and we'll need to contact his family." Ethan's family. The words hit Claire like a wave of cold water. Somewhere out there, Ethan's real parents had been searching for him, praying for his safe return. How long had they been waiting? How many sleepless nights had they endured, wondering if they would ever see their son again? Claire's heart ached for them, but it also ached for Ethan. He had been through so much, and despite the fear he must have felt, he had somehow found the courage to speak up, to reveal the terrible truth. She hugged him tighter, whispering soft reassurances in his ear, though her own voice was trembling. "It's okay, Ethan. You're safe now. We'll make sure you get home to your real family." Ethan didn't say anything, but he clung to her like a lifeline, his small fingers gripping her shirt as though he was afraid to let go. As the officers led Jake out of the garage, his hands cuffed behind his back, Claire's stomach twisted. His face was hard, unreadable, but she could see the fury in his eyes as he glanced toward her car. It was clear that he blamed her for everything, for exposing him, for ruining whatever sick plan he had concocted. But Claire didn't care. She held her ground, refusing to look away, refusing to let him have any power over her. Jake was led to one of the police cars, and for a moment, Claire wondered what his fate would be. He would be charged with kidnapping, of course, and likely face a long prison sentence. But the thought of him being behind bars didn't bring her as much relief as she had hoped. Instead, she felt a deep, lingering sadness. A sadness for Ethan, for what he had gone through, and for the fact that this nightmare had ever happened in the first place. After what felt like an eternity, the police finally allowed Claire and Ethan to come inside. They asked her to give a statement, and she did, recounting the events as best as she could. The officers listened patiently, taking notes and asking questions, but the whole time Claire's thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. He was sitting quietly on the couch, staring at the floor, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His silence was unsettling, and she wondered what was going on in his mind. When the officers finished taking her statement, they turned their attention to Ethan. Claire watched as one of the detectives knelt down beside him, speaking softly, gently coaxing the boy to open up. At first, Ethan didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, his body tense and rigid. But slowly, bit by bit, he began to speak. He told them about how Jake had approached him at his school one day, pretending to be a friend of the family. How Jake had said they were going on a trip, and how he had been too afraid to argue. He described the days that followed, the confusion and fear, the way Jake had kept him hidden, moving from place to place, telling him that his real parents didn't care about him anymore. Claire's heart broke as she listened. Ethan had been so brave to endure all of this, and yet he was still so small, so fragile. She wished she could take away his pain, but all she could do now was make sure he got back to where he belonged. Hours passed before the police were able to track down Ethan's family. Clara could feel the exhaustion setting in, but she refused to rest until she knew that Ethan was safe. She sat by his side, holding his hand as the detective made the call. It didn't take long for Ethan's family to arrive. When they walked through the door, Claire saw the tears streaming down his mother's face, the way she rushed forward to scoop her son into her arms, sobbing with relief. Ethan's father was right behind her, his face a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy. They held him tight, whispering words of love and comfort, as though they couldn't believe they were finally reunited. Claire stepped back, giving them space, her own eyes filling with tears. She had never witnessed such raw, intense emotion before, and it touched her deeply. This family had been torn apart, and now they were whole again. Ethan's mother turned to Claire, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, her hands still trembling as she held her son close. "Thank you for saving him." Claire shook her head, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "I didn't do anything," she said quietly. "Ethan saved himself. He's the brave one." The woman gave her a tearful smile and nodded, though her eyes remained filled with gratitude. As the family prepared to leave, Claire found herself standing alone in the now quiet house. The adrenaline of the night was wearing off, and in its place came a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She sank into a chair, staring at the empty space where Jake and Ethan had once lived. It was strange. Just hours ago, she had thought she was helping a father and son, giving them a place to rest, to heal. But the truth had been far darker than she could have ever imagined. Over the next few days, Claire found herself replaying the events in her mind, questioning everything. Had there been signs she had missed? Could she have done something differently? The what-ifs haunted her, keeping her up at night. She had always prided herself on being a good judge of character, on being able to sense when something was wrong, but this time she had been completely blindsided. The media picked up the story, of course. A local news station reported on the kidnapping, and Claire's involvement quickly became the subject of public interest. Reporters called, wanting to know more about how she had uncovered the truth. But Claire wasn't interested in the attention. She didn't want to relive the nightmare over and over again. All she wanted was peace, to move on from the ordeal and reclaim the sense of safety she had lost. In the weeks that followed, Claire tried to settle back into her routine, but things didn't feel the same. Her home, once a place of comfort and solitude, now felt tainted by the darkness that had passed through it. Every time she walked past the garage, she felt a chill, a reminder of how close she had come to unknowingly harboring a dangerous man. But as time went on, she also found solace in knowing that she had done the right thing in the end. She had trusted her instincts, even when it had been hard to believe what she was seeing. And because of that, Ethan had been reunited with his family. Claire still believed in helping others. She still wanted to give back, to make a difference in the world. But she had learned a hard lesson, that not everyone was who they appeared to be, and that sometimes the people you try to help can bring more danger than you ever anticipated. She promised herself that she would remain compassionate, but that she would also remain cautious. The world could be a dark place, but it was also filled with moments of light, and sometimes the light came from the most unexpected places, from the bravery of a small boy, or the strength to confront a truth you weren't ready to face. In the end, Claire knew she had changed. She was stronger now, more aware of the complexities of the world around her. And though the scars of that night would never fully fade, she had emerged from the darkness, carrying with her the knowledge that even in the face of fear, you could still find the strength to do what was right. The nightmare was over, but the lessons it had taught her would remain forever.